Sex and politics are the recurrent themes in the life and work of Mario Vargas Llosa.
His books include The War of the End of the World, winner of the Ritz Hemingway Prize, and Captain Pantoja and the Special Service, about an attempt by some soldiers to set up a brothel in the Amazon.
Llosa's concern for his country made him one of the very few authors to have sought the presidency of his country.
Mario Vargas Llosa is one of the greatest South American writers of my generation. He's part of the Latin American boom of writers like Jorge Luis Borges, Carlos Fuentes, Garcia Marquez. And what was very exciting growing up in England was to suddenly have this wave of fiction that was unlike anything we had really read about.
I think Europe was very important for myself, as for many Latin American writers, because in Europe I discovered that I was a Latin American. I discovered from Europe that Latin American was a unity, something that I didn't really perceive when I lived in Peru, you know.
Vargas has had a very dramatic background. His father has disappeared 5 months before he's born, and so he's told that his father died. So he then comes to Piura, a coastal city in the north of Peru, and that's where he is when he's 9 or 10, when his mother takes him to the Hotel Turistas to say, we're going to introduce you to your father, who becomes quite a tyrant in Vargas Llosa's life and sends him to a military academy in Lima, knowing that Vargas Llosa really wants to be a writer. And the father wants to kind of stamp this out of his son's ideas, which actually sends him on the path to being a writer. His first novel, At the Time of the Hero, is based on his experience as a military cadet.
¿No te importa que vaya a un colegio de cholos?, dijo Alberto. No, si es la única manera de que te compongas, dijo el padre. Con los curas puedes jugar, pero no con los militares.
I enjoyed selecting passages for him to read out. I never told him what he was going to read out beforehand. So it was almost as if he was rediscovering them and rediscovering why we'd asked him to read out.
Una brújula que confunda el norte con el sur puede ser grave, grave. Muy divertido. It's very funny, huh?
Has this happened to you, Larry?
No, but I haven't read that for 10 years, you know.
He was always a person who took risks. I mean, when he was a young man of 19, he marries his aunt by marriage.
She was recently divorced, and she was 12 years older than myself. I fall in love immediately. And of course, there was strong opposition in the family.
And this is one of only a series of rebellious acts, but based on passion and his belief that he's doing the right thing.
Most of his novels are similarly rooted in autobiography. Despite their setting, Peru in the 1950s, the majority, such as his latest, The Storyteller, have been written in Europe, where he lived in a self-imposed exile for 18 years.
So Vargas Llosa spent something like 17 years in Europe, in Paris and in London, always mining his own experience of Peru, bringing a European sensibility, if you like. And in his autobiography, he writes about meeting the cultural attaché in Paris, who hasn't been back to Peru for 40 years and is completely outdated in his ideas of Peru. And I can see that accusation could be made against Vargas Llosa, but I think very much his experience of Arequipa and Piura, these two cities outside the capital, that's the landscape that infiltrates into his mind. Even though he's away from it for most of his life, he returns again and again to unpicking the landscape of Peru, which is so dramatic. I mean, you cannot leave Peru without having had a hallucinatory experience of the Andes, and Vargas Llosa never worms it out of his system. And in Europe, he returns to again and again to explore it and makes it even more fertile and more exotic, in a sense, in exile. Peru was a civilization created on the roof of the world, written in the stones of Machu Picchu and Chavin, in the paintings of Nazca and Paracas, and in the gold and silver of the Incas. For a long time, the name Peru rang throughout the world synonymous with munificence. In the 19th century, there's a famous description of Peru as a beggar sitting on a bench of gold. And I think what had happened since then is that successive governments had made that beggar even poorer. And I think Vargas Llosa saw an opportunity to make that beggar a shareholder once again in his golden bench.
That is what we are trying to do with this alliance that we have been creating, this alliance of democratic parties, to demonstrate that there is a democratic alternative to this chaos.
When he stands for presidential candidate, the whole world is shifting. Tiananmen Square is happening on the day we interview him in Lima. You have the fall of the Berlin Wall that November. And then 3 months before the election, you have Mandela being released in South Africa. Vargas Llosa felt that in the backwater of South America, there was an opportunity also to shift his country into a better place. I mean, he has this marvelous view that Peru was once at the forefront of modernity and that it could be again. And in a sense, he had then to take the next step.
Símbolo de Mario Vargas Llosa. Símbolo del Fredemo.
Vargas Llosa was an intellectual who had an ideologically inconsistent journey. He began as a communist. He was known as Comrade Alberto when he was in university in Lima. And he then had this journey that took him against Cuba, which he'd been in favor of, and to the Soviet Union. He got very disillusioned. And bit by bit, he turned towards Thatcherite principles, made this transition to a more right-wing approach. And he had this shadow competitor for Peru's soul, a professor of Kantian philosophy called Abimar Guzman. He gave no interviews. He had no manifesto. They had hammer and sickle flags, so they were clearly communist. But he created terror in the countryside. His troops would come in balaclava caps, men and women. They would execute any representative of government.
A quienes izan la bandera terrorista, los peruanos libres y pacíficos, les decimos, no lo vamos a permitir.
This is how I really came to know Vargas Llosa. I went in search of Abimar Guzman.
Sendero's leader was a professor at the University of Ayacucho in the Andes. He has not been seen for 10 years. These are the only known photographs of him.
Slightly foolishly, 48 journalists had been killed, and I hadn't kind of factored that in. And in fact, when I met Efraim Morote Best, who'd been rector of Ayacucho University and who'd recruited Guzman, I said to him, why have you agreed to see me? You kill all these journalists. And he said, oh, because you sounded very nice on the telephone.
Sendero's intention in November was to stop people participating in the municipal elections. Anyone seen in the streets was a legitimate target.
Guzman saw himself as the fourth sword of world revolution. He thought that Fidel Castro was a chorus girl, that he wanted to go extreme in communism. A new birth begins in blood, and he was quite prepared to have the blood that was being shed.
Shall we stand here in this doorway?
When Vargas Llosa went to see Mrs. Thatcher, one of her concerns was how he was going to protect himself in the campaign ahead. And one of the visual element that acted against him was to have an armour-plated Volvo and bodyguards with dark glasses and who were protecting him. Unfairly, because he did need protection, and in the first 55 days of 1990, some 600 people are assassinated by Sendero, including many of Vargas Llosa's candidates in the regions.
Los peligros de Mario están presentes en cualquier momento, en cualquier lugar y de cualquier persona. Por eso es que lo rodeamos tan de cerca, porque de cualquier sitio sale un arma y se acabó Mario.
His wife, Patricia, never quite believed that he had a moral responsibility to do this. She thought that a deciding factor was also that it offered excitement and risk.
Will you ever write about this experience in fiction?
I don't know. Until now, everything I've written has been based in personal experiences. This is, without any doubt, an extraordinary important experience in my life.
I owe Vargas Llosa, as a novelist myself, an immense amount, because it was in Knightsbridge, just after the capture of Abimar Guzman, that I had dinner with him, and he told me some of the details behind the capture that over the course of that meal, I suddenly had a whole novel in my head. And so During our conversations, I was always the person trying to find out more about Abimael Guzman and wondering why he had not really made that a central part of his novels. I was very interested because I was the person who was writing about Sendero as a novelist, and I felt he should be writing about it. And indeed he did later, but not at the time. And I always was puzzled by that, because I think Vargas Llosa, after losing this election, went on to write what I think was his finest novel, The Feast of the Goat. His insight in this campaign, I think, gave him quite an enriching experience that he was able to bring back to his novels, which isn't often the case with people who've gone into politics. I mean, Václav Havel, after his experience in politics, wasn't able really ever to write anything good again. And I think people like Orhan Pamuk hasn't been able really to recapture the energy that got him to win the Nobel Prize. Vargas Llosa would win the Nobel Prize 20 years later. And in those 20 years, he was able to make use of the fertile experiences that he had learnt during this rather disappointing campaign for him.
Now I must say that I'm not sad at all to be back in my studio and writing again, right. Because among other things, I must tell you that I discovered during the campaign that I am not a politician, that I am really a writer, and that what I want to do is writing.
He's a very inconsistent figure, and he would be the first to admit his inconsistencies. The inconsistencies work in fiction, and they don't work in politics.
Before I entered politics, I tried, to have a kind of life only with interesting people and only with interesting and stimulating conversations. This is not possible in politics. You must be prepared to have stupid conversations and to deal a lot with stupid people. You must accept that. And this can be rewarding in a sense, because you are educated about what real people is,
Mario was brilliant at defining what his policies were, but he was hopeless at repeating it. He hated repetition. He went off every day into the hinterland to give speeches to the Indians, but they didn't want to know about shareholding stakes. They just wanted to be told life would get much better. He wanted to tell them why it would get better.
Hablan maravillas, no cumplen. Nunca. Los pobres tienen que estar más pobres siempre.
And so I suppose politically he might have made incredible inroads if he had become president, but he may not have done. I know that when he knew he'd lost by such a large margin, he turned to his family and he said, "I feel very sorry for Peru." But this film is about 35 years old, and I was slightly dreading that it would become very dated and that it wouldn't really speak to a modern audience. And I confess I was really thrilled. And I felt, as I watched this, my gosh, this is a really privileged insight into the mind of somebody who is risking a kind of maelstrom that few of us experience.
Intellectuals are, in many cases, incapable to discriminate between what is possible and what is impossible. That is between fiction and reality, and how this attitude, which has given so many good books to the Latin American novel, in politics has given a lot of tragedies.
He'll be seen as a great storyteller. And I think in an age when we've forgotten how to tell stories that are linked to big political ruptures, you'll look back at Vargas Llosa's oeuvre and you'll see again and again an understanding of the appetites and the selfishness and the maneuvers and the plots and the betrayals and the paranoias, all these things he discovered himself when he stood for president. He understood that by the end better than almost any other writer.
Literature is a kind of revenge. It's something that gives me what the real life can't give me. All the adventures, all the pleasures, or the sufferings, all the experiences that I can only live in imagination. I think literature completes my life.